Good morning, everybody. I'm Joel Kurtzman. I'm a senior fellow at the Milken Institute, and I'd like to welcome everybody to Global Risk. This is a panel that looks at all those things that keep people up at night. So it's a great way to start the conference when you think about all the nervousness, all the things that can happen, and all this great panel who can explain it and put it into terms that are actionable. So I'd like to introduce the panel, and I'll start to my right with General Wesley Clark, former Supreme Allied Commander, NATO, and also the Chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark and Associates. Jane Harmon, who's the Director and President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and former Congressman from California, member of the Homeland Security Committee and the Intelligence Committee. Matthew Burrows, who's a counselor at the National Intelligence Council and in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and Larry Zempelman, Chairman and President and CEO of Principal Financial Group. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for coming. And I'd like to begin just with a few data points that have occurred over the last few weeks. We've had nuclear threats from North Korea. We've seen that Syria has been probably almost conclusively using chemical weapons in its civil war. Iran keeps developing its capabilities. We've had the Boston bomber with ties to Chechen fundamentalists and rebels. We have Twitter, which is getting there first and changing the entire dynamics of what is going on in the world and how we found out about it. We've had one hacking after another, and this is just in the last couple of weeks. So we have a very dynamic situation in the world right now, and I'd like to put slide 30 on the board. If we can have slide 30, please. And I'll tell you why this slide has come up. This is the headquarters in Shanghai. We have monitors here, of Unit 61398 of the People's Liberation Army. And this is kind of one of the main hacking locations in China. And I bring it up because when we had our preparatory call, Larry Zempelman was saying that his organization, Principal, which is a global financial company, was under attack as we spoke on the cyber side. So I thought that might be a good place to begin. So Larry, talk a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. You know, this whole area of cybersecurity and cyber risk has changed very dramatically in the last few years. You know, it started, I think, with perhaps some computer geeks and nerds that were out to see, just how much disruption they could cause. But it's fairly quickly morphed into this kind of activity that you see here. And so today, and again, this has been widely reported, in the press, there are now websites you can go to where the people doing this kind of work will announce which particular companies they're going to go after today. And of course, this is what they call these DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks. And so for at least, I would say, 6 weeks to 2 months, these groups have been, again, broadly going after financial services firms. I appreciate Joel's comment that we're a global firm. I didn't actually think so until all of a sudden we got identified on one of those websites in the morning, so I guess we've arrived. And it's amazing because, as our Chief Information Officer, Gary Scholten, will tell you, these things, they don't do this on Monday. They start on Tuesday. They go through Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They stop at 4 o'clock Central on Thursday and apparently go home for the weekend. So it's a very different sort of dynamic. And again, just to show you how this can change from one moment to the next, the very first time this happened to us, of course, we have a lot of defenses in place, and so we've fairly quickly mitigated that particular event. That went on Tuesday, it went on Wednesday, it went on Thursday. The following Tuesday, they started again, except this time on Tuesday, the amount of, if you will, the amount of traffic that they directed at our website was 6x, 6 times what had been directed to it the week before. So these people can very quickly sort of ramp up and ramp down depending on how quickly you respond, and if they obviously sense that they've impacted a website in a significant way, then they hit it very, very hard. So having the right defenses is absolutely critical.
And I wanted to ask General Clark, because I know this is one of your issues and you've spoken out about it. What's your view? I mean, is this something that we have adequate defenses that we're properly prepared for? I think I know the answer to that.
Actually, not, because most of the U.S., all the U.S. military stuff is on a secure internet. It's isolated. They can't get at it unless somebody makes a mistake and brings in a hard drive that's contaminated or something like this. But all the interfaces on the net are vulnerable, and businesses are very vulnerable, and we don't have the right national policy in place in which the protective assets of the U.S. government are allowed to protect U.S. businesses. We need to put that policy in place. It's been up in front of the Congress, been voted down a couple of times. Our cyber command guy said, please let us help. But instead, companies come running into the National Security Agency and say, this happened to me. He said, yes, yes, yes. And you buy commercial software, but there's no integrated response. We're going against an integrated threat. And I don't want to jump off this too quick, but that building is the smallest tip of the iceberg. So here's what China just told me. I came back on Thursday. They said, you talk about intellectual property. Said 60% of Fortune 500 companies have their R&D facility in China. We know your intellectual property. 82 engineers at NASA are Chinese. You don't talk to us about intellectual property. We know your property. We see your F-22 and F-35. They are not stealthy. You say our aircraft carrier won't work. By 2019, we will have 4 aircraft carriers, and on and on and on. So this is the tip of the iceberg. And the United States as a nation needs an integrated strategy for dealing with China. It's not about a business saying, gee, I think we better buy upgraded antivirus software. That won't help the United States, may help the business temporarily, but we can't allow strategic drift with China. We can't just wait until there's a North Korea crisis, have 8 senators say, go ask China for help. No, that's not the right way to deal with China. They like it, by the way, but it doesn't suit our strategic needs.
Well, we'll get to some of the longer terms in a second with Matthew, but I wanted to ask Congressman Harman about the congressional response. I mean, this is a big threat. Long term, it's getting worse, not better. Well, what has the response been, and what do you expect it to be?
Well, first, let me say I think the problem is more complicated than just an office building in China or any building in China. I think there are state actors that are attacking us, but there are also non-state actors. I'm looking out at this audience. To the extent I see you, you're all way too old for this. You need to be a digital native around 20. Is anybody out there? No. And you can be in a computer cafe in the middle of nowhere, and you can buy an exploit in a sort of eBay, bad eBay forum, and then you can go behind into firms like these and cause unbelievable harm. So this is not just a China-centric problem. What is Congress doing? Nothing. The House passed a bill that at least last year was completely unacceptable to the White House or the Senate. The House bill says there should be voluntary information sharing in the private sector. Certainly it's a good idea to have the information sharing, and companies that share will be protected. They'll have immunity protection, or they'll have immunity. And that's about what the House bill says. The Senate bill that died, a couple of very ugly deaths, and that was the White House bill, said the information sharing should be mandatory, and oh, by the way, the front door to the government is the Department of Homeland Security. A lot of people in the private sector think that DHS is not very competent. My answer to that would be, so make it competent. But nonetheless, Congress so far has passed a bill in the House that was not totally partisan. That was good news. And the White House is finally saying, well, maybe the House bill is okay. So we'll see. But Congress's response has been inadequate. It is a huge problem, but it is not just a problem of state actors. We really do have to focus on these kids in the internet cafes.
So let me ask, looking forward then, you Matthew, did 2030 Outlook report for the National Intelligence Council, which is pretty exhaustive and I have to say quite heavy in terms of looking at many of these issues. And how do you see this particular issue going forward?
Well, I suppose the bad news is that it will go forward. I mean, and we probably, as Representative Harmon was just saying, we've just seen the tip of the iceberg. And we had a concept in the paper talking about individual empowerment. And in many ways, individuals now have the lethal, destructive, and disruptive weapons that used to be the reserve of states. Mm-hmm. And so these are things like cyber, these are things like bio, these are sometimes precision, conventional weaponry, all of that. And I think, the scariest part of this is, what individuals or small groups of individuals can do. I mean, the building you showed is PLA site. I mean, this is something that states have had to deal with other states for some time, and I think is much more in the usual traditional lane for government. And you can say we're behind the curve, which I would agree with, but the bigger issue is this with non-state actors and actually how you deal with them. And I think we really haven't risen to the challenge here yet. Particularly, it's very difficult. There are a lot of issues dealing with privacy, that we hold dear and should hold dear, that make really attacking this issue much more difficult.
Well, we just saw a non-state actor act in Boston. We assume it's a non-state actor. We don't know for sure yet. But this was something where presumably it looks like there may have been training overseas, but that's about it. And we had a disaster, very public, and creating terror, the objective. Is that what you're talking about in terms of we'll see more of?
Yes. I mean, these are, again, going back to this tip of the iceberg, I mean, and I don't mean to sound alarmist here, but, the kind of weapons that which was a crude IED, you could see down the road individuals like that who are self-radicalized actually use a lot more lethal weaponry and cross even a bigger threshold that we haven't seen. And that's actually the much more scary scenario.
Well, Congressman Harmon?
Yes, that's true. Mike Hayden, who was the director of the CIA and also the director of the NSA, the National Security Agency, calls this the new normal. There will be self-radicalized people. There are in our midst. We've actually thwarted more plots than have succeeded. These kids in Boston got lucky, and they figured out how to build bombs that actually work, which most kids don't. And maybe they had outside training for that, but the instructions are readily available on the internet, especially through this Inspire magazine, which everyone has talked about, which is now in its 10th edition in colloquial English, produced in the boonies of Yemen. That's terrifying. But I wanted to say something maybe positive. Number one, first, the response of Boston, both the first responders and the paramedics and the people, was exemplary. Number two, the country did not overreact. And number three, corporate people who run the corporate world know this principle of managing risk. You don't get anywhere if you just hunker down. And so how do we get anywhere against threats like this? First of all, they're not going to be as big, I don't believe, as 9/11 was, ever. There are going to be some kids with maybe more sophisticated bombs. Maybe they can do more damage, or they will be these digital natives out in the boonies of Mali buying an exploit and maybe hurting some of our infrastructure. But they're not going to kill probably 3,000 plus people ever. So that's not going to happen.
We hope you're right.
What do we need to do, though? We need to have a long-term strategy. That's something the NIC understands, and that's something that corporations understand. All we have at the moment are tactics to defeat this threat right in front of our nose. And Congress, as I already said, or maybe I haven't said it yet, is risk-averse. And they deal in terms of, ooh, I don't want someone to run against me in a primary. So they want zero risk. I think the right answer, and the folks at this conference should, I hope, embrace it, is to have a longer-term strategy so that we minimize risk, have people prepared for risk, and have a narrative about what we stand for that persuades some kid in the boonies somewhere not to strap on a suicide bomb or not to buy an exploit and try to bring down some smaller piece, because I think that's all they're capable of infrastructure.
Let me ask General Clark, because on the tactical side, in terms of the response, Boston's my hometown, so I was very proud of the response. But on the strategic level of coordinating all these different agencies, the intelligence that we did have and so forth, it didn't seem to be working all that well. Is that disparity between now that we have one piece, at least it seems much more figured out, are we going to get the other piece figured out? I mean,
Well,
is big data, or are there...
I think anytime you have an incident like this, you have to go back and unpack it. You have to do your after-action review. You have to bring everybody in. You have to say, what happened? Why did it happen this way? How can we do better next time? And there are lessons that will be learned from this. For example, it's starting to surface now that maybe there was some indication they'd gone back, and how come if they'd been in Dagestan, somebody hadn't checked on them, and why had they not followed up, et cetera, et cetera. But on balance, I have to say that we've come so far since 9/11. I was very reassured strategically as well as tactically by the response. I saw a lot of national agencies coming in there. You know, the ability to assimilate those photographs, to get those photographs out. Of course, the Boston police had the lead. And Boston doesn't have as many policemen per capita as New York City does. And everybody knows now in the aftermath it doesn't have the same intelligence and anti-terrorist capacity or counter-terrorist capacity that New York City
Boston's
does.
a very intelligent city.
But it has plenty of smart people, and it has the citizens. I really was reassured by this. And, you know, as terrible as this was, I think back to my experience in the United States. I went into the military from West Point in 1966 as a lieutenant. We had riots all over the country. Detroit, Baltimore were being burned. Parts of Washington, D.C. were burned down. We had a guy who climbed up in a tower in Texas with a sniper rifle and killed 30 people at the University of Texas one time. We had a postal worker in 1986 who walked into it's a country that has a certain propensity for violence. It's still going on. Everything we can do to go after the ideological connections of this thing and take them away, that's the strategy that Jane's talking about. How do we get out there and do the communication? Look for these people, but you know, maybe the bottom line on this one is what the uncle said. These guys were losers. We want winners in American society. We want to bring people in and help them be winners. Not only the immigrants, but everybody here. And that's the real strategy for the society. But I give us about an A- on this. I think it was really pretty astonishing. And if I had been Al-Qaeda out there, I would have said, oh my God. I mean, we didn't get away with much on this.
So we're getting our act together, which is very good to hear. And the one piece, Matthew, that I thought was very interesting, and it's been in the news, but it hasn't been really dragged through all the everything that the news is doing these days, and that is that Russia and the United States actually were sharing information about disruptive characters. Now, how much does that go on, and is it taken seriously? Is it something people do just out of a kind of diplomatic courtesy, or is there real cooperation now that we don't see taking place?
Well, there is real cooperation, and maybe because it is below the radar, it actually is more successful that way. Certainly, again, one of these things that happened after 9/11 where there was an effort really to step up what we call those liaison relationship with other services. And they are service-to-service ties. So you can really build those confidential relationships. Now, there is a concern with the Arab Spring that some of those countries first aren't putting the effort necessarily, Egypt and others, into that kind of counterterrorism work. So you don't have the potential necessarily for, engaging as much as you did before. But it is important to, when you're thinking about this, to separate what's happening maybe at the surface or at the broader diplomatic level from what is much more at the law enforcement or intelligence level.
Now, the way I heard about the incident first was through a tweet, and that was before any of the media got wind of it, and we had lots of information at the Milken Institute, informal, incorrect, but some of it was correct. At the same time, or maybe it was a couple of days later, there was a false tweet about more bombs at the White House and so forth. And the markets did a big tumble for a short period of time. And I wanted to ask Larry, this is really in your wheelhouse in terms of now you have to contend with information and tweets and so forth that affects your business directly. How do you contend with that? How do you know the real tweets from the false tweets?
Yeah, I mean, this for us, I think, really goes under the banner of sort of broad enterprise risk management. And I don't think there's any company probably represented in this room today that isn't, finding the need to spend more around enterprise risk management. I think it's interesting. We've been talking about a little bit around cyber risk, distributed DDoS attacks, but and you mentioned the
DDoS means
distributed denial of service, the website attacks. But you mentioned the false tweet. I mean, another one that I'm still very interested to find out what was going on was the Chicago Board Options Exchange, where their system was shut down for 3 hours. Now, it's been reported as though it was a software glitch. I sort of wonder about that. That was just after, a few days earlier, American Airlines reservation system went down. So you wonder if some of this is beginning to kind of move around a little bit, and that the whole effort here is to sort of find what can be destructive, destructive to the population, because that's, I think, really what they're after. Perhaps today more that than the sort of harm that gets done by a few loose cannons at Boston. It's really about, can we find certain leverage points into the U.S. economy that we can be very disruptive. So again, even though it's not part of my portfolio, I worry a lot about state and local governments and whether they have the adequate defenses against people like this. I know it was reported again a number of months ago that the state of South Carolina was being hacked for a period of 9 months. And so this thing, I think, will continue to kind of move around and to find pressure points in the economy. Again, I think all you can do from the standpoint of running a business is you have to think about diversification. You have to think about, you have to model different scenarios. You have to have backup plans, disaster recovery. All those kinds of things now are just a normal, natural part. And the last thing that I'd say about it is, perhaps not unlike General Clark had to do in his many years in the military, you got to practice it. You got to practice it, you got to practice it, you got to practice it. And sometimes that, feels like, well, we're just kind of going through the motions, but I'll tell you what, it really matters.
General Clark?
So, I try to look at this thing from a strategic standpoint as well as from the business standpoint. I think what you're saying about business is exactly right. But if you were a state actor and you were looking at this, and I recall a guy coming in with a briefcase on a handcuff talking to me 20 years ago in the Pentagon about some of these things that finally got out of that. It's all in the public domain today. But if you were a state actor and you said, if something goes wrong, how can I handle America? You wouldn't wait until something went wrong to try to handle America. You'd be doing reconnaissance and probing on a constant basis. And you wouldn't announce it, and you wouldn't necessarily. So you might go to American Airlines and say, I wonder if I can disrupt American travel networks. Go to an airline, see if you can shut it down for an hour. Good, okay. Don't do anything else to it.
No one might notice with the airlines.
Exactly. Let it, call it a software glitch, hold it there. You know, we, in the military, we go up against other nations' air defense radars all the time. And a lot of people don't know this, but take a country like Iran. So they've got a radar. Most radars have 2 or 3 different power modes, frequency modes, and modes of operation. They have a wartime emergency mode they try not to use. Well, if you're doing your electronic warfare reconnaissance, you want to activate that mode. You don't want their normal search mode because you know if anything ever happens, they'll forget about that. They'll go to wartime emergency. You'll go in there. You won't know you're being tracked, and you won't have any means of attacking electronically what they're doing.
So are you saying we want
you buzz them. You buzz them. You try to scare them. You make them, whoa, they're coming in. We do this all the time to other countries. We did it for years to the Soviet Union. Don't you think that's what countries are doing to us on cyber right now? That's what's going on.
So are you saying, just to follow up, so Iran just shot down a drone. Was that one of those tests in your view?
I don't have any way of knowing, but it only makes sense. We are the most vulnerable country on cyber. As Congresswoman Harman was saying, the Senate bill was the right bill. It was defeated on partisan grounds because it required businesses to cooperate. It put the equivalent of a national security tax on a business so that the Cyber Command could look after America. It was trying to establish electronic cyber boundaries for the country. We voted it down. We want to put a physical fence up, but we don't want to have a cyber protection fence. We've got to change that thinking because we're being scouted and probed all the time. And, one business's plans that work in the case of a business failure, they might not work in the case of a broader attack and more powerful attack. So you've got to use what's available. The U.S. Cyber Command, great people, great technology, got to empower them to help protect us.
Congressman?
Yeah, well, a couple of comments. First, we do practice. The Joint Terrorism Task Force that came together in Boston knew each other. All the different layers of security agencies, including our intelligence agencies, were physically there analyzing what happened and in real time collecting all those photos and the videotape that was available to identify the hijackers, which happened not as fast as it would happen in London, because in London there are cameras every 3 inches, but in Boston, which doesn't have that many cameras, the real time was under 48 hours. I'm sure that's true, which was impressive. So we practice that. We practice problems that could occur in cities, roving snipers and other issues, closure of ports, etc. And I think we've done pretty well over recent years. I agree with Wes. I think I'm bullish on our capability. Second point, we have to be right 100% of the time. They have to be right once. And these are either lucky kids in the Boston case or possibly very smart kids who probe on an asymmetric basis what our vulnerabilities are. And if they find one, they move. And in the Boston case, for example, they dropped those backpacks, we now know, just shortly before they blew up and after the bomb-sniffing dogs had walked by. So they had decent enough tradecraft. Somebody else might not, and those packs might have been found before they blew up. So that's the second point. And finally, and it was mentioned in the business context, we build in redundancy. When you go into LAX, you may not know this, but I know this because I've seen it. There are layers of, well, I don't know what to call it. There are just layers there, let's put it that way, so that to make sure that we know who you are, including who I am, before you get on a commercial airliner. And if one of those layers doesn't work, there are other layers. And we haven't had an attack on an airplane lately. And that is because we've hardened the airplanes, but it's also because we have redundant protections in airports, and we really know who's getting on the airplanes.
Well, let's go to some of the more traditional areas that we talk about on this panel, such as North Korea. I mean, we've had pretty dramatic and probably an escalation in terms of the threats. I don't think we've ever heard before threats to actually send nuclear weapons to the United States. Is this just a little dog barking, or is this something that's real, or do we know? Let's start with General Clark.
Well, I think it's several different things. First, it is a little dog barking. And I think he got a little carried away and went a little overboard. I'm told the Chinese finally said, "Shut up," and he stopped immediately. But I think behind it, it's part of a longer-term pattern, and it's a pattern that I think you have to think of as Chinese checkers. So a lot of us played chess when we were kids, and we think of a knight and a bishop and these strategic moves, and that's the way the Russians think of the world. The Chinese don't. They have marbles. They've got this rock sitting in the ocean between Japan and China. That's a marble. They can go after that anytime they want. They've got the South China Sea. They've got North Korea. Their long-term objective is that the United States will back off. They don't want to do it at the expense of a war. They don't want to do it at the expense of disrupting their economy. But Xi Jinping is a leader fully empowered domestically, and he's going to prove his empowerment internationally, and he is going to be assertive. Right now, in China, it's like it's all about Japan and how bad Japan is. So Korea was starting to get in the way of that, but they need Korea. They need that to sort of nudge us out at the right time. At the right time, it will turn out, we'll go to China and say, "Please help us." They say, "Actually, you were the ones causing the tension. If you didn't do your team spirit exercises, if you wouldn't put those troops in there, people would be happy." Then they'll have it coordinated so that ultimately there'll be a unified Korea. The little guy will be replaced, and they'll have the equivalent of a giant Hong Kong that's there on the edge of China, and it'll be serving China's interest. That's being set up. It's a Chinese checkers play.
So are you saying that they were in some ways in control of this behavior, and it got out of hand?
They have some, basically they have some influence on this. And, the real problem is that we've given them so much influence. Starting in 2002, when we discovered they'd violated the earlier agreement on the nuclear weapons, instead of calling them on it, the administration was at that time very anxious to keep the focus on the Middle East and not divert from Iraq. So they ceded the problem of North Korean nuclear violations to China. I can recall high members of the administration saying, "Well, China has much more influence over North Korea than we do." Must have made the Chinese, well, it kind of scared them at the time because they were trying to pretend they didn't have that much influence. So we called them out on it. At one point, they even took U.S. Ambassador Chris Hill into the room and they said, "Look, you keep at here's your North Korean counterpart, you two talk." They tried to get out of this, but we put them in it. Now they kind of like it. And we're giving them the Chinese checkers game to play with. Okinawa was Chinese property. The Japanese took it. They want Okinawa back. They want Taiwan back. They want us out of the area. And as one Chinese official told me, he says, "Why do you think it's named the South China Sea? It's our sea and everything in it." So I know that there are countries in Southeast Asia that will be happy to fight to the last American sailor against this. That's what we don't want. We have to manage this China problem, starting with North Korea.
Let me ask you, Matthew, to get your view on the North Korea-China relationship. How do you see that playing out? Do you agree with the general?
Well, I guess I disagree a little bit that I'm not sure that the Chinese think that they can really control the North Koreans. I mean, they have showed a lot of frustration, and actually it came out publicly in this last, there was articles in the FT and other places that they obviously ceded to really show the degree to which they're frustrated. And then I think, too, what we may not know is as much as what's happening on the ground. I would say that I think there are a lot of pressures, obviously, on both the new leadership in North Korea and also the new leadership in China. My worry would be miscalculation, that in order to, burnish your credentials as a successor and so on, you're much more willing to go up to the edge with the saber rattling, and equally on the Chinese side, how much they have pressures on them, the new leadership as well, to appear to uphold Chinese rights and prestige.
Congressman?
Yeah, there's also new leadership in South Korea. Park Geun-hye, who is the daughter of President Park, who was a strongman in the 70s, was elected and sworn in just a few months ago. And there's new leadership, which is old leadership, but it's back, in Japan. So the danger of miscalculation is exponentially more, playing over a bunch of leaders who haven't worked together in the past. So I agree with this. The last comment I'd make is that I think China fears that a reunified Korea, which is the hope certainly of many in South Korea, would be under the U.S. sphere of influence, and they don't want that to happen. So keeping North Korea in this checkers game is in their interest, provided it doesn't blow them up and blow up the neighborhood, and provided that it doesn't disintegrate, and then they have millions of refugees in China.
That's right.
So let's go to the red line, as it's called, in Syria. Now this red line apparently has been crossed. It looks like that, and yet there's no response from the world community. What should the response be? Has a true red line been crossed? And what's the difference between killing people with machine guns or bombs and killing people with poison gas?
Joel, I was just going to make a more general comment that, I think what we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years is that we've gone from sort of maybe a single enemy or a limited number of enemies to a much greater number, but now things are playing out on a more regional basis. And, we've already talked about how in the cyber area, there's been a sort of an ineffective response by Congress, and some of that is political partisanship. Some of that, I think, also is a sort of a collective fatigue. I'll just speak for myself, but I think every morning when you get up and you read about another regional conflict off in a place a country I can't pronounce, and you worry about the United States getting sort of drugged down in 3 or 4 or 5 places around the world. And so I think one of the real challenges that we're going to have going forward is sort of managing, I don't want to call it the PR around it, but I'll say the practical reality that as a nation, we have to be strategic in what are the things that are really important for us, what are the things that really are strategic, and what are the things that, frankly, we have to leave to other governments in other places. And I think North Korea might be an example of that. I think these are the things that we have to consider as a nation, rather than, again, I think we've learned our lesson that to just go off into every place there's a hot spot in the world can be very, very, first of all, very costly, but also very unnecessary.
Can we have slide 11, please? That was not slide 11.
So here's another global risk.
Hopefully this is a test. We'll wait 1 second.
This is very possibly caused by a cyber attack.
Okay, so let's remain calm and look at the armaments in the Middle East. Just to add a little color and background to this discussion so far, we're talking about an extremely well-armed part of the world. One actor there has just crossed a line that the rest of the world is extremely worried about, and all the other countries there are essentially well-armed, poised, and ready to go. Can we see this escalating? Is that what this red line being crossed means, General?
I'll start. I want to hear what Jane has to say, too.
Or should we start with... Yeah.
I think that the Assad regime is keeping a very careful eye on what's going on and world opinion. They're restricting the number of casualties. I think probably chemical weapons were used. They were used softly. They were used marginally. There was an effort to see if they could get away with it. May have been done accidentally, but they're certainly watching the response. They know what the pattern is in the so-called Arab Spring. Assad knows there's no way out. He knows it's a long-term battle. He's very much aware of fatigue in the West about getting involved, and he's going to escalate this to the level that he can keep it at to try to handle the Syrian opposition. So the question for the United States is not so much the red line. The red line is it's sort of out there. It's what is the sensible policy? If you could get Syria right, if you could bring a democratic government, Western-oriented secular government, to power in Syria, think of the incredible benefits to the region.
Congressman?
I agree with something Larry said just before, which is that we can't intervene everywhere. There is enormous fatigue, and we should only intervene where we, the U.S., has a strategic interest. I think we have a strategic interest in getting Syria right. And the reason I think that is, if we could get Syria right, that would be a way to persuade Iran to back off on its pursuit of nuclear weapons. It would also be protection of our ally Lebanon, which is a very fragile, sort of kind of pluralist democracy, and especially our ally Israel, which is on the border of Syria. Using chemical weapons is a big deal. Bashar al-Assad's father did, we think, although we don't have the proof we would like to have, use chemical weapons in his country, and he killed approximately 50,000 people. That's a lot of people. There are 70,000 already dead. There are 2 million displaced inside of Syria. There are 1 million refugees, many of them in Jordan, which are destabilizing Jordan. And President Obama is the one who said this is a red line. So my own view is that we're being watched carefully by the Syrian government. And if we don't act, they will view that as being empowered. We're also being watched carefully by the rest of the world to see if we mean what we say. And my recommendation is that we take the next step, which is to arm the opposition, quote, we trust. We do have some way of distinguishing among these people, to create an ability for the UN to come in, which the UN is offered to do, and initially Syria said okay, to monitor, to check out whether the chemical weapons were used. You have to check that out on the ground. And to, at least I would do this, to make certain that the chemical stockpiles are secure. Those are two things that I think there would be worldwide support for. And frankly, I think if those things were done, and if it were proved that the big stockpiles have been weaponized and this guy's ready to go, I think that would be the tipping point. And the opposition would create the change in Syria that they want. It wouldn't be us going in on a top-down basis and creating the change that we want.
Let me ask Matthew on this question. There have been a lot of reports that the opposition is more and more composed of fundamentalist elements, Al-Qaeda and so forth. Is there a side that the United States can be on? Or isn't it, I mean, it may sound cold, but isn't it preferable just to let these groups fight?
Well, as in a lot of situations, there's no good options. I mean, and I think part of the problem with allowing a conflict to continue to spin out is that the extremists are going to take over. And obviously, this gets also to the question of whether you can actually establish a democracy. I mean, I'm not sure that we may be past that point. Conflict tends to breed, more conflict. So putting these players all together and in trying to put this situation on more of a peaceful terrain is going to be very difficult. I think the U.S. has to obviously deal with actors it may not particularly like, but try to get them into a coalition, try to put enough pressure that you can get some sort of agreement or settlement.
Do we have that kind of sway?
I'm not sure, And again, I think if you look, at conflicts and past conflicts, I mean, it tends to be very difficult to get actually a peaceful solution or one that is self-sustaining.
Larry?
Well, I just wanted to add a comment or observation, Joel, and that is that, again, we often approach these, take Syria as an example, we often approach these issues as, if we get rid of the current regime, then democracy will be established and it will flourish. And I think, again, our experience over the last 30 years would suggest that that's naive and not completely accurate. I think there's plenty of evidence around that says that it takes at least a generation post some sort of dictatorship like you have had in Syria for many, many years. It will take at least a generation. So when I say generation, 20 to 25 years before you move to anything that any of us would consider to be sort of a true democracy. So the reality is that the early on periods, even once you get rid of very terrible folks like has happened in Syria, but the reality is, and it's often like in business, it actually gets worse before it gets better. And once again, I worry about the American people's willingness to go in, take out some of these bad guys, and then see that situation deteriorate for 5 to 10 to 15 years before those people start to understand how democracies actually work. And we're seeing that play out in the Middle East today, Egypt and other places. So it's not like you just get quickly, you get rid of the bad guys and then, everything settles down, democracy's instilled. I wish it were that easy. It clearly is not. So this becomes kind of a long-term, unsettled sort of prospect where, again, I go back to what I said before, how many places around the world can you have this process going on where the United States is expected to be sort of the big brother, right, if you will, the powerful brother who's making sure that everything goes well? That's a tall task.
Joel, there is a pattern. If you go back, as we were talking about historically, and look at this, the ones that are successful are the ones where the government on the outside is connected to people on the inside, and they actually try to put a stake in the ground on territory. And where that happens, there's a much better chance. We did the dance in the Balkans for 3 years. And it was actually, although it was U.S. intervention that finally brought the end of the fighting, it brought the end of the fighting on successful terms for the people of Bosnia because of the courage of the leadership in Bosnia. They actually did attacks that weren't going to succeed. When they failed, they mobilized international support behind it. They knew they weren't more powerful than the Serb military. So I think there's another set of cards that the Syrian opposition may have to play. I think maybe the red line is enough. It may be. But it may be the next step is these safe areas, so-called safe areas next to the borders like Turkey. You bring your refugees in, you say, this is my free Syria. And then you wait for Assad to say, well, you can't have free Syria. He masses his forces. He does something wrong. The international community is outraged by this. And it also gives the Syrian free government a chance to come together on the ground and provide services and establish a pattern for governance independent of early elections. I'm no fan of these early elections. I've been through it in Haiti, I've been through it in Bosnia, been through it in Kosovo. It leads to a lot of ethnic separation, and what you want technical governments. So I think there's a way forward. I think it doesn't put too much burden on the United States, but it's something the United States can't lead. It has to be supported by the people of that country. It has to be led by them, and we will support it.
Okay. Well, let's, in the minutes that we have remaining, let's change gears a little bit. Can I have slide 3? If you look at this slide, it gives you a picture of just the different types of recoveries going on in the world. Europe, compared to the U.S., is not doing so well. And the currency is in trouble. The debt situation is being managed almost ideologically in certain countries, out of fear in other countries. Let's talk about in sort of quick bites, let's talk about the future of Europe. And let's start with Larry.
Well, I think, again, short comments. I mean, quickly, I think we now understand that Europe's going to have to be more of a balance of growth and austerity. Fascinating to me to see the discussions a couple weeks ago about, the research that Reinhardt and Rogoff did. I don't know, we call it a fat finger error, or what we call it, a data input error. But I think the challenge, for any sort of austerity-driven philosophy is that the length of time you need for austerity to work is much longer than any political period. And thus, you're not going to get consistent political leadership because at the end of the day, the people won't put up with it. And so I think it was, in my opinion, again, it's a bit of a flawed policy approach to begin with, because you have to balance austerity with growth, because otherwise the people won't stay with the program. And if they don't stay with the program, you may end up being worse off than if you'd never gone down that path.
Matthew?
Well, I think it's too early to tell where Europe comes out. I mean, the optimistic case would be that it would be 10 years of turmoil, but they would actually establish a single market. They would do the labor market reforms. That will take some time, so you can't tell before 10 years. My worry would be that you're going to see Europe not take those drastic measures and slowly sink. Sink in the sense that also the EU begins to unravel. I mean, people already complain it punches below its weight now. A lot of people would like to see it take another step towards federalism. It's hard to see that happening in the present mood in Europe. So I think they're at one of these pivotal turning points. In the best case, it would be still some time before they could come out of this. But that would be a good thing. Use the crisis to make those radical moves. But in the worst case is that they won't do that, and there'll be a slow unraveling.
General, you have an opinion on the euro, I know.
The Europeans have an incredible capacity to muddle through. But in this case, they got to start muddling faster because the banking system is coming apart on them. They don't have the right policy mechanisms in place. Monetary policy alone is not enough to manage this. They must have some degree of grip on fiscal policy, and they must start by having a real central bank, not just a bank that sets interest rates.
Congressman?
Well, just to pile on, I think we would all agree that the business model of the EU is flawed in terms of having one currency but no ability to manage the fluctuations in that economy. The other point is that early in this, the Germans, who had the strongest economy in Europe, were able to maximize their advantage. I think that Merkel figured out that the absence of stimulus wouldn't hurt Germany, but it might hurt some of her friendly competitors, or as my kids would say, frenemies. So that worked beautifully. Now there's a backlash in Germany, and Germany is paying a price too. So I think the test will be whether there is some stimulus added, which I hope there will be, and I think it's a test for our country too. Austerity alone doesn't work. Austerity is necessary. I'm very proud of the fact that I was a blue dog during my terms in Congress and focused on fiscal responsibility and voted for and worked for a balanced budget in 1997. But I think we have learned over the years, or we should have learned, that we also need short-term stimulus. And what I would do here, I don't know if it fits that well in Europe, but I think we're starting to do it, is permit an infrastructure bank that could be privately financed or based on public-private financing that would put millions of people to work restoring or remaking our crummy infrastructure in this country. If we want a 21st century economy, we've got to have 21st century infrastructure.
Well, that's great. That's all we have time for. This has been very thought-provoking, and I'd like to thank the panelists, Larry, Matthew, Congressman, General. Thank you very much, and thank you.